There was also a sense that in 1966 there was a deliberate sidelining of the Republican movement. Those, of course, many of whom did not recognize the legitimacy of the state after its creation in the early 1920s. And there was also a concerted attempt, I think, to subsume the labour movement into the broader nationalist story, the idea that the labour movement would not be able to find space for itself and its labour history in 1966. Lemass had also made another interesting intervention in 1965 when he referred to those Irish men who had served in the British Army. He went as far as to say in the Dáil that they had died as honourably as many of the thousands who had given their blood for Ireland. And that was a very significant and quite a brave intervention to make in 1965. But again, the personal element, I think, is significant. Sean Lemass grew up in a part of Dublin City which provided many, many recruits, nearly 30,000 recruits for the British Army during the First World War. Some of them would have been classmates of Sean Lemass. It's a reminder of how those classes of that era, the Christian Brothers schools and other schools, that they went in different directions. And Lemass was very conscious of the need to address that particular theme. Others perhaps were not so keen. And again, there was the cultural angle. It did prompt criticisms about the cultural state of Ireland at that time. Dublin Magazine, for example, a cultural magazine, suggested that if we are prepared to confront reality in 1966, it must be admitted that from a cultural point of view, this state is a disgrace. And it pointed out, for example, that the Northern Ireland Arts Council received more money and funding than the Arts Council of the Republic, even though the Arts Council of the Republic was catering for a much bigger population. So there were those concerns being expressed. There were also contemporary debates and school competitions in 1966. There were public debates also. One of them went under the title in Naas, "Is Patrick Pearse turning in his grave?" So that question being asked 60 years on, and again it'll be asked, or 50 years on, it'll be asked 100 years on also. There was also the issue of teaching. What were people being taught in schools in relation to 1916, in relation to that period? Well, for many who were being educated, the lesson stopped in 1916. Jean Kerrigan, the journalist, has written a wonderful account of how he discovered the Irish Civil War in 1968 when he was watching The Late Late Show. And The Late Late Show hosted a discussion with Carlton Younger, who had written, he was an Australian author, he only died a few years ago, he had written an account of the Irish Civil War. And at that stage, Jean Kerrigan, in 1968, was 19 years of age. And he was watching The Late Late Show. And he got more and more angry. What civil war? Nobody had told him that there was a civil war. And he fished out his school textbook. This was James Carty's Junior History of Ireland. And he discovered that in 1916, there endeth the lesson, as he put it. The idea that they were not going to engage, the curriculum was not going to engage with that Civil War period. And there have been many people over the last couple of years who have talked to me about their rediscovery of Irish history once they had left school. So you do need to be aware, I suppose, of the extent to which there were still certain taboo subjects in relation to the commemoration of that period. And then there was an added complication in relation to the outbreak of the Troubles from 1969 onwards. The Troubles had an extraordinary impact, you could say, on remembrance and memory and commemoration of the revolutionary period. You can trace the extent to which so-called traditional and new interpretations could sit rather uncomfortably alongside each other. If you take a really underused source, for example, the Capuchin Annual, which really was a marvellous magazine in all sorts of ways and covered a huge range of different topics in Irish life and Irish history. And yes, it was avowedly nationalist in relation to how it remembered the 50th anniversary, for example, of the Kilmichael ambush or Bloody Sunday in 1920. And at that time, it referred once again to the total victory of Irish Republicans 50 years previously. It referred to their high idealism. But alongside that, the Capuchin Annual included an article by a young historian called Michael Laffan, who was later to teach in UCD from the 1970s onwards. And Michael Laffan subjected the idea of Irish republicanism to a new kind of analysis or critique. It was very much, he said, a slogan and a symbol, as opposed to actually meaning much in practice. The idea that they didn't interrogate what an Irish republic might be. Michael Collins, for example, was asked by an American journalist in 1920. What did he think an Irish Republic was or might be? And Michael Collins's very honest reply was, we actually haven't given that much thought. The idea was that they were very much focused on separation from Britain, and what would come afterwards was not something that needed to be discussed in 1920. So you can see those new, I suppose, interrogations of the ideology or lack of ideology of the revolutionary generation. We can also perhaps exaggerate the extent to which this question of how to deal with the violent birth of the state, both this state and the state of Northern Ireland, that was the dominant issue in historical scholarship from the 1970s onwards. Terence Brown suggested that there was a lot of patient and sane scholarship in the 1970s and the 1980s as historians waited for source material to be released. There were contributions from people like Leland Lyons in Trinity College, David Fitzpatrick also in Trinity College. They did marvellous work. Lyons in relation, I suppose, to the broader national picture, Fitzpatrick in relation to the grassroots experience, the idea of a revolution that was guided from below and was essentially conservative. But historians did differ in relation to the emphasis, of course, they placed on political violence. Some have suggested that that amounted to a green scare in the 1970s and the 1980s, which has been disputed by John A. Murphy, the Cork historian, and others, as exaggerating. The idea that historians injected themselves collectively with a revisionist virus in the 1970s, it has been argued, is exaggerated. The idea that historians can ever act as a collective, perhaps, is exaggerated. They're far too fond of their own particular furrow. But at the same time, there's no doubt, and Lyons addressed this in relation to the dilemma of contemporary history, that there were historians who felt it was a civic duty to try and counteract what they regarded as the propaganda, the Republican propaganda, and the Republican version of history, which they did not believe, to go back to O'Toohig's point, was about scrupulous attendance to evidence. But whether or not they struck the right balance in that quest is certainly open to debate. There were those who believed that they were bolstering the state from the 1970s onwards in their approach to history. So again, that is something that is relevant in the 1970s and 1980s, but I wouldn't exaggerate the contribution of the historians in relation to that. There's also the ongoing debates then between politicians during that period of the Troubles about how to mark that period of Irish history. Richie Ryan, for example, when he was in opposition in 1972, referred to the pygmy-minded pettiness of the Fianna Fáil government in refusing to acknowledge the 50th anniversary of the signing of the treaty in December 1921, suggesting that this should not be a Fine Gael commemoration, it should be a state commemoration. Fianna Fáil, for very understandable reasons, had no interest in commemorating the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty 50 years previously. But you can also trace throughout the 70s and the 80s the growing concern, if not growing embarrassment, with the idea of the revolutionary past and with the bloody birth of the state. It's interesting to look at the reflections of civil servants who were working in the Department of the Taoiseach at that time in relation to some of these problems. To give you an example, there was a statue of Roger Casement commissioned in the flush of the 1966 commemoration of the Rising, and when it was finished, it was decided that it was not an opportune time to unveil it because of the Troubles. And this is linked to another issue that had to do with the state abandoning the traditional military parade in order to commemorate the 1916 Rising, the belief that it wasn't appropriate given what was going on the island of Ireland in the 1970s. And that Casement statue was effectively kept in storage. And Richard Stokes, who was a Department of Taoiseach civil servant, referred to the pendulum in relation to the remembrance of Irish history. He did suggest in a memorandum in 1974 that it was quite clear that there was a less jingoistic attitude to the history of the revolutionary period. But he also felt that the pendulum was beginning to swing too far. And this was his reaction not just to the cold storage of the Casement statue, but also the idea from a Fine Gael minister that the Asgard boat, which had transported the rifles into Howth in 1914, should be scuttled at sea and should be allowed to die at sea. And he certainly didn't agree with that. There were others, including the cultural commentator Niall Montgomery, who wrote in 1975 about the importance of the bicentenary of the birth of Daniel O'Connell, who Montgomery said in a letter to the Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave was the first in a long men a long list of Irish men of peace, in contrast to those who were associated with the line of blood. And he associated Patrick Pearse with that, who he referred to as the Irish Rosenberg. The idea that Patrick Pearse was akin to the Nazi philosopher from that earlier era. My friend Richard Stokes in the Department of the Taoiseach found that very objectionable. He said, "This is not true. Pearse was trying to awaken the spirit of a nation, not annihilate a race." It'll give you an idea of some of the debates that were going on behind the scenes. There were also references in 1979 to the difficulty of how to generate a popular movement around the name, the figure, the character Patrick Pearse. Because 1979, of course, was the centenary of his birth. And what do you do in 1979 in light of the Troubles? There was a proposal from a Republican group, for example, that a 35-foot statue of Patrick Pearse should be erected in O'Connell Street, which would cost £75,000. The government decided that the Republicans should not be allowed to make the running on this. They also decided that it would be a prime target if erected for loyalists, and I'm sure it would have been, given what had happened to the head of Wolfetown, the Wolfetown statue at an earlier stage. But there was also that question of what to do again with Pearse in 1979. And the solution was deemed to lie in referring to Patrick Pearse not as a soldier, not as a warrior, but as an educationist and as a poet.